Our scripture reading this morning comes from Exodus chapter 3, and it's a familiar story, and it picks up in verse 1, and it reads, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, What am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Then he said, I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this holy mountain. Friends, the word of God for the people of God, may He bless it to our hearing, to our understanding, and to the living of His word. Now, we've been in a sermon series that we've called I'm Too Old for This, where we have been talking each week about specific topics relating to getting older. A few weeks back, I wrote in here on a hoverboard at the challenge of my son to talk about the different generational cohorts and how we as Christians can better bridge gaps in communications between folks of one generation or another. And we had actually done a study after that and realized that we had 7 generations represented in this church, all the way from the greatest generation to Generation Alpha, which are kids my kids' age. And it's a beautiful place to be, to put your children in that kind of atmosphere where they get that kind of diversity in age to learn from. Last week, we talked about caregiving and our Christian call and how we are here on this earth to care. And that since our bodies break down over time, it is a sign that we are not just entrusted to God, but we are entrusted each other into each other's care. And the sign of our fragile bodies means that we were made to receive care and to give care. So we prayed for our caregivers, and we encouraged you last week to go and reach out to the caregivers in your family, to give them some time off, some words of support, and sit and listen to their struggles. And this week, we have a difficult topic to handle, and it's one that perhaps all of us have our own experiences with, and that is of, as we get older, we tend to get sick. Different ailments hit us. Our bodies don't work the same way that they're used to, specifically diseases that are really prevalent, not just in our church, but everywhere. We talk about Alzheimer's, dementia, and cancer. And before we get into what are some very heavy topics, I wanted to start with this statement from our United Methodist Book of Resolutions about health in general. And it reads, health is the ultimate design of God for humanity. Though life often thwarts that design, the health we have is a good gift of God. When God created humankind, God declared it was supremely good in Genesis 1. Among Jesus' statements on the purpose of His presence, in the statement that He came, that we would have life to the fullest in John 10. Every account of Jesus' ministry documents how Jesus saw restoration of health as a sign of the kingdom of heaven becoming present among us. When John the Elder wrote to Gaius in 3 John 2, he wished for him physical health no less than spiritual. The biblical narrative is filled with stories of God's healing presence in the world, and we know that Jesus healed so many people, and this includes spiritual, psychological, emotional, social, and as well as physical healings. But that begs the question, if health and being healthy is God's ultimate design for all of us, well, it doesn't take too long before we begin to start asking questions like, what about diseases? Like the pandemic and COVID-19 that we're facing now? What about things like Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, and others? If it's God's will that we are healthy, then why do these things persist with us or someone that I love? And so before we get right into those specific diseases itself, I want to say just a little bit about that, right? If God is all good, and God created us to be healthy and wants us to be healthy, not just our physical bodies, but our social relationships and our family relationships and everything in between that includes the health of our globe and ourselves. Well, then why does things like cancer and COVID-19 exist in our world? Why would God allow such a thing to happen? And when tragedy strikes, it's a common question for us to ask, why? Why would something like that happen? And we turn to our faith for answers, but answers often don't come easily. We wrestle with making sense of the suffering that we witness in light of our good God and in knowing who Jesus and God is, and oftentimes our questions are left unanswered. And the tragedies that we often face go unexplained. And in a sermon titled The Promise of Understanding, John Wesley, the founder of our Methodist movement, says, we may never know, he said. He writes, we cannot say why God suffered evil to have a place in His creation. Why He, who is so infinitely good Himself, who made all things very good, and who rejoices in the good of all of His creatures, permitted what is so entirely contrary to His own nature, and so destructive to His noblest works. Why our sin and its attendant pain in the world has been a question ever since the world began, and the world will probably end before human understandings have answered it with any kind of certainty. But the short answer is, we don't know why disease and pandemics, natural disasters, and other suffering are a part of our world. While Wesley admits that we cannot know the complete answer, he clearly states that suffering, and I want to be clear about this, suffering does not come from God. God is infinitely good, made all things good, and rejoices in the good of all of His creatures, including our own health. Our good God does not send suffering, and according to Wesley, it is entirely contrary to who God is, God's own very nature, and so destructive, he says, of even His noblest works. Suffering is not a punishment or a sin or a judgment from God. We suffer, and the world suffers because we are human, and a part of a system of processes and a physical environment where things go wrong. Our bodies don't work like they're supposed to. They break down. And instead of seeing that as a sin, as we talked last week, as our bodies break down, it is instead a sign, and that how we are creaturely made to be put in the care of God, but put into the care of one another. Here's an example when leaders in Jesus' day were asking the same question. There's a story in John 9 when Jesus and His disciples encounter a man born blind, and the disciples then ask Jesus the question. They come up on the blind man and they say, Rabbi, who sinned so that he was born blind? This man or his parents? I've been asked similar questions, not necessarily relating to diseases or that kind of sickness. In a conversation I had with another churchgoer, a very good a friend and a person I was talking to, asked me one time when we were walking through a particular section of Canton, Ohio, he said, well, Don, what's wrong with those people? Do they just not know Jesus? As if to say there was some kind of moral failing that would lead to someone's poverty or someone's state of how that they lived or the problems that they encountered. And don't mind you, friends, that poverty is a disease in this world that needs healed every bit as Alzheimer's or cancer or any other disease that you can lift. But I'm going to continue here. Jesus' answer back to His disciples is neither He nor His parents. Tells us that the disciples are asking the wrong question. This happened, Jesus continues in the story, so that God's mighty works might be displayed in him. Jesus asserts that it is in our response to suffering that God is found. In moments of everyday grace and in the grand and sweeping gestures of care and solidarity with those who suffer. God's mighty works are found in the hospitals, in our nursing homes, in our shelter, and I hope our churches. Jesus is calling, in this story, his disciples and us into ministry. We're to join Jesus in displaying God's mighty works. We are an extension of God's presence in the midst of this tragedy as we become side by side with those who are suffering in ways that we don't even comprehend or understand. We are to be the agents of healing, working to restore God's order to people's lives and our communities. This is why we call it here at Crossroads, Healthy Homes, Holy Hearts. It's about the whole creation, the whole person, the whole family, the whole neighborhood, the whole community. You get the point. And when we talk about people and friends of ours who have suffered underneath of these diseases, I want to say quite clearly, it's okay to ask these questions, and it's okay to wrestle with these questions, and it's okay to feel pain, and it's okay to feel hurt, and it's okay to be angry with God. Oftentimes when I would think about this, I have been in many hospital rooms and taken Eucharist into people and left that hospital room and wondering whether or not providing the sacrament in that moment to the person who might not remember it or might not have known what was going on, if it made any good. If holding the hand to the person who no longer remembered me as their pastor or even their family members around there didn't really matter. What was happening in these moments? What does it mean to say that our loved ones no longer remember us or even God? We read our Exodus story today, and what we have to remember, no pun intended, what we have to remember is that when the Israelites were in Egypt, not all of them remembered who they were. More importantly, whose they were. Moses was on the run from just killing a man, certainly forgot that fact, and it is God who grabbed his attention to pull him back and pull his people back to remembrance. I find that the story of the Israelite people in our Hebrew scriptures in exile, in the stories of the Exodus, we find a God with steadfast, universal presence and love can be known experientially and relationally by those cut off from their past and in living in physical, emotional, and intellectual dislocation. Though they may have forgotten God, God has not forgotten them. And in that affirmation lies their and theirs very identity, their worth, and their hope. What does it mean to say when our loved ones see our faces and call us by another name and forget who we are, or seem to forget everything that they learned in Sunday school over the course of their life, to forget God? What does it mean? When the truth is, our faith, our very faith, has never been about our own individual faith or even my own individual faith. In the end, faith was about, if faith was about what I believe, then it would be up to me to end life with a peak of inspiration or theological insight. It would all just be about what I know at any given time. Faith has to be more than that. But what if we peak sooner than our years endured? What if at all the end we are not as much as we were used to be? What if we need someone else in those moments to hold our memories of grace before our years of failure run out, when our bodies finally let us down? As I said before, I've lost track of how many times I've taken communion or talked to folks with some form of dementia. And what does it mean to recite those words to these people? Do this in remembrance of me. when someone has run out of remembrances. It means, I think, the memory of Christ can never be contained by the mental capacity of any of its members. Let me say that again. The memory of Christ can never be contained by the mental capacities of any of its members. And that sometimes the community of faith holds the memories of saving grace for us. It's not that different when a congregation vows in a worship service, when my boys were right up here on this stage to hold the faith of an infant who has just been baptized in our church. Then we are waiting for the child to grow into belief, and at the other end of life, with these folks that we go and visit who have lost some of their mental capacities, we are receiving that faith back from those whose memories are too worn out to hold their own belief. The great faith belongs to the church, and we're always, always, always holding it for someone. In the waning days of my great-grandmother's life, my great-grandmother Lily, God bless her soul, I was blessed to do what I do for just about everybody when I visit towards the end of someone's life. We go and we sing. I take the United Methodist hymnal and I sing the songs that people want to hear and people love to hear, and some of the ones that I know and I like to sing that I think I can sing pretty well if I'm going to make it a pleasant experience for anybody. And in the early days when I would question, what good does this do if they might not even remember that I'm here? I'm comforted by the fact and encouraged by the fact that I get to hold a measure of faith in that moment for her. And then when I sing the song, Amazing Grace, how sweet thou sound, I once was lost, but now I'm found. In many ways that could mean God and me holding that memory of His saving grace for her, having lost her memory in that time, knowing that she is not forgotten by God and never will be. And knowing that I am a part of the great cloud of witnesses in the community of faith, knowing that there might be a day when someone will have to come and hold my faith in their hands and remember for me. God never forgets, always remembers. And God's memory is the inexhaustible source, the infinite fountain from which flows all existence. It is within God's memory that we live and move and have our being. Jesus tells us in the end of Matthew, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." And hear this, "and remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age." God sending Moses back to a people that has forgotten Him is a sign of that. And every time that we show up for our Alzheimer's patients in their rooms to hold their faith and their promise within our hands and remember that promise as a community, we live out the Great Commission of Jesus Christ that tells us to remember that I am with you always, even if they can't in that moment. I was moved particularly this week by a prayer written by Carolyn Hanali, and I'm going to close with this. It's simply titled, An Alzheimer's Patient Prayer, and I hope that it encourages you to continue to show up in those moments and remember the great faith that we have when they can't. Hear these words. It says, "Pray for me. I was once like you. Be kind and loving to me. That's how I would have treated you. Remember, I was once someone's parent or spouse, and I had a life and a dream for the future. Speak to me. I can hear you even if I don't understand what you're saying. Speak to me of things in my past which I still can't relate. Be considerate of me, my days are such a struggle. Think of my feelings because I still have them and can feel pain. Treat me with respect because I would have treated you that way. Think of how I was before I got Alzheimer's. I was full of life. I had life, laughed, and I loved you. Think of how I am now. My disease distorts my thinking, my feelings, and my ability to respond, but I still love you even though I can't tell you. Think about my future because I used to. Remember, I was full of hope for the future just like you are now. Think how it would be to have things locked in your mind and you can't let them out. I need you to understand and not blame me, but Alzheimer's. I still need the compassion and the touching, and most of all, I still need you to love me. Keep me in your prayers because I am between life and death. The love you give me will be a blessing from God, and both of us will live forever. How you live and what you do today will always be remembered in the heart of an Alzheimer's patient, and I add, always, always, always remembered by God.